नमस्कार, सुस्वागतम, केम छो, आदाबर्स, गुड आफ्टरनून। आप सभी का पीआरएल के अमृत व्याख्यान में स्वागत है, अभिनंदन है। A very warm welcome from me, Anil Bharadwaj, for the PRL का अमृत व्याख्यान. Today is the 57th व्याख्यान of the 75 episodes series of व्याख्यान्स, which is being organized as a part of PRL's 75 years of legacy and history in fundamental physics and space sciences. Established in the year 1947 by the father of Indian space program, Dr. Vikram Sarabhai, the PRL's Platinum Jubilee coincides with India's 75 years of independence. Hence, it's a joint celebration of the development of science and technology in India by PRL under the banner of PRL का अमृत व्याख्यान. Today, we have yet another very distinguished व्याख्यानकर्ता, Professor Michel Danino, who is a visiting professor of humanities and social sciences at IIT Gandhinagar. And he is going to deliver the talk on the Saraswati River and the Indus civilization, which is a very hot topic and dear to all of us with respect to the Saraswati River and the Indus civilization. We greatly appreciate and thank Professor Michel for accepting our invitation and joining us today in the PRL का अमृत व्याख्यान, which is a part of PRL's Platinum Jubilee celebration, as well as of Azadi का अमृत महोत्सव. I request my colleague, Professor Anil Shukla, now to kindly introduce or formally introduce our व्याख्यानकर्ता today to the audience at WebEx, as well as those who have joined us live on the PRL YouTube channel. Over to you, Shukla.
Thank you, Professor Bharadwaj. Really, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Michel Danino, whom I know very long association with Jyoti and are working on these things. So he doesn't need much introduction. So as a customary, Professor Michel Danino is a French Indian citizen who likes to be called a lifelong student of Indian civilization. He is living in India since 1977, last century. He spent a few years at Auroville, Tamil Nadu, before shifting to Nilgiri Mountains, where he resided for 2 decades. And in 2003, he settled near Coimbatore and accepted Indian citizenship. At present, he is a guest professor in IIT Gandhinagar and has been teaching courses on Indian civilization and knowledge system and assisting in Archaeological Science Center at IIT Gandhinagar. He is also a convener of CBSE Committee for the course on knowledge, traditions and practices of India. Professor Danino has written many books on proto-historical India. 3 of these books includes The Lost River on the Trail of the Saraswati, Indian Culture, India's Future, and Sri Aurobindo and India's River, quite recently, good book. Professor Danino is a member of many societies such as Indian Archaeological Society, New Delhi, Indian History and Culture Society, the Indian Society for Prehistoric and Quaternary Studies, the Indian Society of History of Mathematics. He is a former member of Indian Council of Historical Research, a member of Central Advisory Board on Culture and National Steering Committee for the implementation of new National Education Policy 2020. In 2017, he has been awarded Padma Shri for his work on education and culture. With this, I would like to invite Professor Danino to deliver 57th Amrit Vyakhyaan of PRL entitled The Saraswati River and the Indus Civilization. Professor Danino, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Bharadwaj, Professor Shukla, Professor Lokesh Sahu, and all distinguished faculty and researchers at PRL. It's a privilege to be invited to this Amrit Vyakhyaan. And in fact, as I told a few of you, I've been a visitor to PRL occasionally for some of the research that will be presented here today in this talk. And I'm actually just sitting a few kilometers away in IIT Gandhinagar, close to the capital of Gujarat. So I'm honored and very happy to give this talk, not only because some of a little bit of the research which I will present was actually made possible thanks to PRL, and this I would like to acknowledge upfront, but also because this is a topic which remains very alive in the popular imagination of India. Imagination may be, it may be in the right direction, it may be in the wrong direction, but anyway, it is alive. And ultimately, we cannot, negate its existence. So my attempt is basically multidisciplinary. Let me also put this straight from the beginning. I'm trying to harmonize something from the text, the literature of India, from the archaeological finds, and this then of course we will include the Indus civilization in this aspect, and also from scientific researchers, especially geological river studies, geochemistry, sediment studies, and so on. So there is a possibility, in my opinion, of a good synthesis between all these facets, which is not so common. If you take some other, great cultural issues of ancient India, you may not easily reach a convergence. Here I submit that a convergence is possible, though there are certain questions still left to be answered, and therefore there is still a lot of scope for further research. Without further introduction, let me share some slides which will make the whole issue much more concrete and perceptible. I hope this is visible to all. So this is a map of where we are going to operate, basically. It's a map of Northwest India, but we are going to also include parts of Pakistan. I will return to this, and why is this the region that concerns us? So we have to remember that the problem of the Saraswati comes from basically ancient Indian literature initially. It is a textual issue at first. There are certain misconceptions in this popular imagination, and these are propagated by the media. First of all, the fact that Saraswati is a mythical river. We will see that there is nothing particularly mythical about the way it is presented in the Indian literature. It's a very physical, concrete river, and it is, of course, associated with many cultural myths, but that does not mean that it is necessarily mythical itself. The second modern myth, if I may call it that, the second modern myth is that it was rediscovered recently through remote sensing. No, it is not so. And we will see that the problem is an old one. What is the problem? It is that Western scholars, European scholars to be precise, German, French, British, in the early 19th century, started translating the Rig Veda because they had access to it finally. And this, as you know, is the most ancient text that we have in India. And there probably never existed an older text than the Rig Veda. I'm not going to deal with its date now, but what is very clear and striking is that the Rig Veda's landscape is Sapta Sindhava, and it is known as such, called as such. And the Indus, Sindhu, its tributaries, the Sarasvati River and others are named. So I will come back to this in a moment, but the Sarasvati is not only named, it's also described as the mighty river, Maho Arna Sarasvati. It is impetuous, its flow is unbroken, it flows from the mountain to the sea, Girbhya Samudrat. So there are all these descriptions which, let us say, puzzled immediately the European scholars. Why? Well, because there is no such river today of size, of a sizable dimension, flowing from the mountain to the sea. So therefore, they also noticed that it receives a lot of praise. In fact, it is the first of the Indian tradition of turning rivers into gods or goddesses, mostly goddesses, but sometimes, like Brahmaputra, for example, is a god. not a goddess. So this tradition begins with the Saraswati. There is no other important river in the Rig Veda which is turned into a god or a goddess. They are all revered, but this creation of a Saraswati goddess is a special phenomenon in itself. And therefore, Saraswati is Ambitame, the best of mothers, Naditame, the best of rivers, Devitame, the best of goddesses. So a lot of high praise, more than 70 mentions in the Rig Veda, and the question is, if this was a river, where was it? Now there is a very big clue, and this clue is in the 10th mandala or book of the Rig Veda, and it is the famous Nadistuti Sukta, the hymn in praise of rivers, where 19 rivers, but there are more in other passages of Rig Veda, are named. They are named very rigorously from east to west. And they begin, as you can see in red, by Ganga, by the Jamuna, followed by Saraswati, followed by the Sutlej, then the Parushni, which is the Ravi, then the Ashikni, which is the Chenab, and so on. And it concludes not only with the Sindhu or Indus, but there are also Kubhaya, Gomatim, Krumum. These are the Afghan tributaries of the Indus, flowing, from the Baluchistan and all the western mountains flanking the Indus Valley. So this is the landscape we have, and we are told that there is between Yamuna and Saraswati and Shutudri, which is the Sutlej, there is a Saraswati river. Now, before I proceed, we can draw a map. Why am I drawing the Saraswati like this? We will see very, very shortly. But this is the exact sequence of the rivers listed, some of them, not all of them, listed in this Nadisuti Sukta. And you can see that the person who composed this hymn, at least 3,000, 3,500 years ago, or possibly much more, had in a single sweep of the eye, his mind's eye, had the entire geography of North India correctly listed through its rivers from east to west. It's a perfect match. So now, and if you ask, how do I know that Parushni, for example, is the Ravi, or Ashikni is the Chenab? Well, it's very, very simple. There's absolutely no controversy about that, because we have not only the evolution of the names in the literature. For example, Shutudri will become Shatadru in the Mahabharata, which means with 100 arms, and Shatadru eventually will become Shatluj. So all these etymologies, also helped by the mention of those rivers in Greek records, are very clear, and there's no problem about them. Therefore, the identifications are quite clear. And not only that, there is the strange fact that there are actually several Saraswatis in India. In fact, today, you can list 20 Saraswatis across the whole of India. In Gujarat alone, we have two. One flows from the Aravalli Hills through Patan. It's a small seasonal river, not so small when there is a good monsoon like now. And the other, much even smaller, is close to Prabhas. There is a small Triveni Sangam a few kilometers north of Prabhas in Saurashtra. There's also one Saraswati there. But between Yamuna and Sutlej, it so happens that there is also one. So the question was, of course, whether this had any connection with the clues given in the Rig Veda. Now, in this map of 1760, you can see that the existence of this contemporary river, known as here Susruti, I will get a proper pointer, here, as you can see, is recorded by one of the earliest British maps. And there is also, we'll return to this Ghaggar river here, of which Saraswati seems to be a tributary. Right. Now, this goes on. I could spend a lot of time showing you a lot of ancient maps. This is a better map by James Rennell, sometimes called the father of Indian geography. Never mind that, but his maps were very precise for those days. And again, we have the Saraswati River, and we have the Ghagar, which is now Kagar or Kankar. Of course, all these spellings will have a lot of alternate spellings. And you have here the Yamuna or Jamuna, and you have here the Satluj. So there is something going on. And the last ingredient of this jigsaw puzzle, if you like, is that the British started exploring this region. You know, the British were, whatever their faults may have been, they were extremely meticulous and rigorous in documenting the subcontinent. The flora, the fauna, the social composition, the geology, the geography, and so on. Hence, you know, this Geological Survey of India, the Survey of India itself, Archaeological Survey of India, and so on and so forth. Anthropological Survey of India, Linguistic Survey of India. So these are all, you know, essentially British colonial institutions, and they have given us very precious records. Now, in this region, they sent topographers and geographers very early in the 19th century for a very simple reason. They wanted to find a route for an army to be able to walk from Delhi into Sindh, because Maharaja Ranjit Singh was still holding Punjab, and they were not very keen to confront him head on. Ultimately, they will conquer Punjab after his death. So they wanted a direct route from Delhi to Sindh, and they identified these. I will skip those details, but these people who were all military people, as you can see, but also experienced topographers, traced the course of the Ghagar, and they said that this is the route we want. Now, what they recorded is, first of all, that they were ancient ruins. They didn't know what they were along the course of this dry bed. Number two, they recorded a local tradition that the drying up of this river caused the desolation of the entire region. Number three, they noted also a small seasonal river called Saraswati as a tributary of the Ghagar. And they noted one more thing, which I forgot to mention here, a series of wells, open wells of fresh water, sweet water along the bed, which they said would be able to, you know, supply an army, walking army, with water, right? So the British eventually never used this route. They conquered eventually Punjab and then Sindh in the 1840s. But these were very precious indications, and now the question could be resolved. It was resolved in 1855 by a French geographer, very distinguished in his days, Louis Vivien de Saint-Martin, who wrote a book called A Study of the Geography and the Primitive People of India's Northwest According to the Vedic Hymns. And his problem was, where is the Saraswati? So he put together the Vedic evidence which we have seen from the Rig Veda, right? The location of the river between Yamuna and Satluj. Then the British topographers, he has had access to their reports, and the local tradition of one Saraswati. And he said this has got to be the relic of the ancient Vedic Saraswati. So you see that this is not remote sensing, and it's not a recent discovery. It's 1855, and he recorded that, you know, it was recently found by the British topographers, still quite recognizable, was followed far to the west and confirmed the correctness of the tradition by which he refers to the existence of the Saraswati. And after him, immediately, all Indologists, this is Alexander Cunningham, the founder of the Archaeological Survey of India. We have lots of maps. I'm showing you only this one, where now the existence of this Saraswati here is recorded. And as you can see, it's actually a tributary of the Ghagar, which is here. And this is the Ghagar. So again, many different spellings, but this is how it flows. Very interestingly, Cunningham shows the Yamuna bifurcating. We'll keep that in mind, bifurcating as it hits the plains. And this is something that Himalayan rivers sometimes do. If you sweep all the way to Bengal, you will see that some of them, this is the phenomenon of avulsion, they bifurcate either permanently or sometimes just for a little while. After depositing, a certain amount of sediments, they have to bifurcate and spread their bed, and then erosion takes place, and the final bed gets delineated. So this is quite interesting. And we can see that now there is a consensus. This is C.F. Oldham, who wrote two papers, very important papers, they're always referred to, on the Sarasvati specifically, trying to trace it. You see old Sarasvati River here, the Ghaggar is here, and tracing it all the way. Now it has different names. Ghaggar becomes Hakra in what is today Pakistan, and the name continues almost all the way to the Rann of Kutch. So hence the dotted lines, because there is no water now. So it's not a full line like the Indus, which is of course here. It's a dotted line, but this is how the British geographers later on and geologists, there was also one R.D. Oldham, not related to C.F. Oldham, who was the founder of the Geological Survey of India, and who also contributed papers. So there's no time to go into all this very interesting history, which I detailed in my book. But one important other aspect before we go into the more recent discoveries to note is that this river, as I said, was described as fully flowing in the Rig Veda. It is Giribhya Samudrat. But the later Indian literature, and there's no time to go through all of it, I'm only here showing you the Mahabharata, but it is also in several Brahmanas, which are late Vedic commentaries on the Vedas, describe the river as breaking up. It's no longer continuous. For example, there is this point known as Vinashana. Vinashana in any Indian language is well understood as meaning loss, disappearance, and so on. So this is recorded in those texts here. I've given the references. And in Mahabharata, because in Mahabharata the entire war takes place in this region. And the final battle between Duryodhana and Bhishma takes place on the banks of the Sarasvati. So we have a consistent location for the river. But now we have also the fact that it no longer flows fully, and all kinds of legends are now invoked to explain its disappearance. By the time of Kalidasa, much later, the word Sarasvati itself becomes a metaphor for disappearance. So if you say that a king is like Sarasvati, it means that his name has vanished. His name is no longer remembered. So it's quite interesting that we have a kind of a consistent picture of a river that flowed once upon a time fully and later on broke up. So this is as far as the literature goes. Of course, there are many more detailed analysis with all the tributaries. There's a lot of literature, but there's no time to. I'm just extracting the important conclusions. And now we have to shift to the current landscape. So this is the landscape that we have today. Basically, you can see that this is the Ghaggar, that this small Saraswati is there, which will flow only, and it's a tiny stream today, it will flow only during good monsoons. Ghaggar also dries up outside of the monsoon, but during powerful monsoons, and I witnessed one myself in 2018, where I crossed the Ghaggar somewhere here on the way to Chandigarh. No, I'm sorry. No, somewhere close to Ambala, and it was a massive river. It had received tons of water from because there are so many more streams and tributaries, and it was almost 1 kilometer wide. I'm not exaggerating. Time permitting, I could even show a small video. But anyhow, the point is that otherwise these are all seasonal rivers. During dry seasons, they will not flow. And you can see that the system has a lot of known tributaries. And you can also see that the Sutlej is flowing very close by. And in fact, as I will show one thesis, it's not yet rigorously proved, is that once in a while, of course, part of the Sutlej flowed into this system, but it's understood that the major contribution of the Sutlej was at least something like 10,000 years ago, 10 millennia ago. But it is also proposed by some of the research, I'll come to that once in a while these channels were reactivated for a short while. And it doesn't take much, because it's a matter of just a few, not even a few meters, less than that, of differences in level. So it doesn't really take much for a reactivation of some of those ancient channels. I'll return to this, but this is the landscape. This is where we have the junction between the Ghaggar system, which is here, and this river, which is called today the Chotang or Chitrang. It was probably the Dreshadvati of the Rig Veda. That's another question. And maybe this is the bed that Cunningham was showing us as being a bifurcation of the Yamuna. Today it is not directly fed by the Yamuna anymore. Now, one thing, so you could say, if I stopped here, you could say that, well, the question is resolved. Saraswati has been found, its ancient bed has been found. We can do more and more research on it if we like, but there's no more question. Well, there is a new question which is posed by the discovery almost exactly 100 years ago. 101 years ago was the discovery of Harappa, 100 years ago was Mohenjo-daro, and in 1924 was the identification of this Indus or Harappan, sometimes called Indus-Saraswati civilization. And there's no time to go into the fascinating story of this discovery. In fact, we had a very nice lecture by Professor Nayanjot Lahiri at IIT Gandhinagar, and it is online, I believe. But you can see that initially, as I said, Harappa is discovered, Mohenjo-daro, and then more sites in the Indus Valley, hence the name of Indus Valley Civilization. But today, of course, there are lots of sites in Gujarat, lots of sites in Haryana, Punjab, even Western UP. So therefore, the term valley is abandoned by most archaeologists, and we simply say Indus Civilization or Harappan or Indus Saraswati. But actually, strictly speaking, none of those terms are very, very satisfactory. But there is no real consensus among the archaeologists. It doesn't really matter as long as we understand what we are talking about. So you can see that there are lots of sites, and quite a few of them along the basin of this Ghaggar river. So archaeologists refer to it variously. Either they call it the Ghaggar River or the Ghaggar-Hakra River, or they call it also, and you can see that there are some sites here also in Pakistan. Actually, the international border is precisely where my pointer is. No, actually, I should be, yeah, it is here where my pointer is located. And you can see that there are lots of sites in upstream and as well as downstream. So sometimes they call it Ghaggar, Ghaggar-Hakra, or Ghaggar-Saraswati, or Saraswati. All these terms are there. It doesn't really matter. But how do we know that there are all these Harappan sites upstream in the Ghaggar-Hakra system? It is thanks to an explorer, Mark Orelstein, British explorer, who did some fantastic work in Central Asia, in what was called then the Chinese Turkestan, in Iran, in Balochistan. He loved, distant, faraway, desolate regions. That was, his state. And he was quite intrepid because at the age of 78, he embarks on exploration of the Thar desert, starting from Bikaner, basically, and Bahawalpur. Bahawalpur is today called the Cholistan Desert of Pakistan. It is the extreme northern end of the Thar desert. And so he starts initially with an automobile that the Maharaja of Jodhpur has given him. Then he continues his explorations on horseback and finally on camelback once he enters what is today Pakistan. And then he interestingly notes a lot of observations on the river system. And he knows that this Ghaggar system is identified with the Saraswati, which is why he uses the word lost Saraswati in his report. But the most important thing is that he finds proof of Harappan objects, pottery, a few Harappan seals, Indus seals, and some typical Harappan daily objects of daily use, which allow him to conclude that there are Harappan sites in this region. So very soon after independence, there is a consensus building up between the geographers, the geologists, the Indologists, those are from 19th century onward, and a number of archaeologists that this has got to be the Saraswati River, and now it has, in addition, Harappan sites. So we find this starts with Amananda Ghosh of the Archaeological Survey of India in about 1950, explorations of this region, where, for example, the site of Kalibangan is identified as a Harappan site. And we have a lot of sites. So some of them are very clearly on major paleo beds, ancient deserted beds of rivers. Others may not be, or they are on minor paleo beds. And basically it builds up, and we end up having today possibly more than 1,000 sites of both the mature Harappan period, which is, in the 3rd millennium BC. It starts about 2600 BCE. So remember, more than 4,500 years ago, and it ends about 1900 BC for reasons which I will explain. So maybe I should point to some very well-known sites, like not only Kalibangan, but there is Anupgarh, Rakhighari has been in the news. Birana and Maramali are very important sites also. There is Farmana near here, and so on. In Pakistan, this is the international border. You have Ganwariwala, which is a very large site, and a whole cluster of mature Harappan sites, which perhaps were not always fed by this Ghaggar Hakra river. It might very well have been fed at some point by some direct connection with the Satluj. So I'm sorry, this is, yeah. So I hope my slides are still visible. And we now come to the last but one penultimate piece of the jigsaw puzzle, which is satellite imagery. I'll be brief, because what satellite imagery has done, it can be just summarized, is simply tracing more and more paleo beds and their possible connections. This is, for example, the first study of 1980, directed by Yashpal. I should have at least here honored D.P. Agrawal, because he worked at PRL for so long, and he was one of the co-authors of this paper. And as you can see, they were trying to trace the connections between the Satluj, all channel of Satluj, the Ghaggar system, and on the eastern side, the all channels of, so they are called Y1, Yamuna 1, Yamuna 2, which would have connected the Yamuna system with the Saraswati or Ghaggar system. The problem is that while satellite imagery is very helpful in tracing those paleo beds, and then researchers on the ground can use this very important input, they cannot give us dates. Satellite imagery, remote sensing cannot tell us when those channels were active. So this is, of course, a limitation that we need to understand. But you can see that, again, there is a connection here, and it doesn't take much. It's very close. Those two systems. Can I don't know how to, just a second. I want to, yeah. So you see that the connections between the Yamuna on the one hand and the Satluj on the other hand don't take much to be established. It's a matter of just, if you walk actually, and I have not walked, but I have driven through this whole landscape from, let us say, Delhi to Chandigarh and beyond, you will not even notice a slope. It looks like a very, very flat terrain. So this interfluve, Doab in Hindi, this interfluve doesn't take much to be modified, and that is why we will find it full of paleo beds, because many of these beds, when they were active, kept actually shifting. So this is the picture that remote sensing gives us. This is one of the old maps supplied by ISRO, where you can see we are now close to the international border. There's a very, very large, very well marked bed. It is marked not by a depression. Please note, if you go there, you will hardly, this is slight depression. You can see some slight incision in the landscape, but rather what the satellite picks up here is a modification in the vegetation pattern. Because there is dampness underground, the vegetation is different. And these are, of course, folk scholars and enhanced scholars. And this is easily marked once you digitally process the images. And they have plotted here some of the Harappan sites which were known to them at that time. This is again Kalibangan, close to the junction between the Ghaggar on the north and the Chotang on the south. So I could show you many, many more such. What we can see again is that, drawing one neat line for the Sarasvati or the Ghaggar is deceptive. We actually have multiple beds, which is quite natural. The Indus also, which you can see here on the northern part of this image by ISRO, the Indus is also a river that has shifted massively during its ancient history, and this was traced by some geoarchaeologists like Louis Flamme, for example. So these paleobeds, yes, do connect with the Rann of Kutch, but when exactly the river flowed in full is one of the important questions we have to resolve. There is no obvious direct connection, as was assumed by some scholars, between the Luni system, which is on the northern edge of the Aravalli Hills, and it all connects to the Little Rann and Greater Rann of Kutch. There is no obvious connection, except perhaps maybe when we come close to the Rann. But the two systems seem to have been independent as far as the current knowledge is. Now, more on the paleo channels. This is more recent research by Mehdi and others, where they trace, especially in the Rajasthan and Haryana region, they trace some of the important paleo channels and the sites which are located on them. So this is a map, drawn on the basis of the imagery. And you can see that there are wider paleo channels and there are more narrow ones, which would perhaps have been active for a lesser time. So this can only be ascertained through ground sedimentology studies, geochemistry studies, and so on. Here, at the same time as they were basing themselves on satellite imagery, they also took sediment samples, sediment cores from all these points. And you can understand the strategy which has been followed by all similar geological studies. Some of them were done, in fact, at PRL under the leadership of Professor Ashok Singhvi. Some were done and also Professor Jyoti Ranjan Roy and others. So you can see here that the strategy is simply to cut across some of those channels and try to get some representative samples and then get dates and so on. But you will see that this problem is not so simple. First of all, before I come to that, this is a kind of a compilation by Orengo, Cameron Petrie, and others of all the satellite imagery to date. You see here on the top left some of the major references, and basically you see what I was mentioning. If you walk from the Satluj to the Jamuna, you are basically walking through an almost continuous series of paleo channels. So the whole area has been swept by these paleo channels. Swept because it doesn't take much if there is any slight change caused by neotectonics, caused by possible earthquakes, caused also by sediment deposits by the rivers themselves. Then the rivers will be, you will be avulsions taking place, you will be shifting of beds, and therefore this very flat terrain is vulnerable to this constant shifting and creation of new channels, all of which are abandoned today. As I said, only the Ghaggar Hakra, with some of its tributaries, I'll come to that, are reasonably flowing seasonal rivers during the good monsoons. Right, now, the channels were also traced in terms of their buried water resources. And this was done by a series of studies. I mentioned here only one by Saini, Professor S.K. Tandon, and others, where taking samples again, dating them through OSL-TL, and getting some dates which are, in this case, fairly recent. It connects all the way with the Harappan civilization, but let's come back to that a little later. You see that they are able to map possible buried channels with still water resources available. We have more precise studies now done through electroresistivity measurements, where basically, to keep things very simple, you put 2 electrodes in the ground and you measure the resistivity wherever you wish. You can move east-west, you can move north-south, and you end up mapping places where there is a lesser resistivity and therefore more presence of water, or at least humidity, and places which are much more dry, where you have a higher resistivity, of course. And this is a beautiful kind of map of the underground, gray fluvial levels, which have some important water reserves, especially the dark blue one here. Now, this gray fluvial sand is very, very important to us because it is of higher Himalayan origin. It is not originating in the Shivaliks, which are now the source of the Ghaggar Hakra and all its tributaries. The Shivaliks cannot contribute to these gray. It can only contribute to these silty and clay layers which are above. So we have contributions from the upper Himalayas with important water reserves, to the extent that the Haryana government, Rajasthan government were a few years ago contemplating drilling hundreds of bore wells through these reserves of water for irrigation and other purposes. So some of us, try to convince them not to do that because you would be depleting those buried water-bearing sand layers in just a few years, whereas it would be rather important to preserve them for the future. I hope this has been heard. I'm not very, very sure what the latest decisions might be. So this is another view of, this is by Imran Khan, who was a PhD student of Professor Rajiv Sinha of IIT Kanpur. And I'm borrowing all these beautiful diagrams where you can see here the sand saturated with fresh water. You can see that in some parts it is quite deep. You have the depth here on the right. So that will be about 40 meters here. But in other parts, it is reasonably shallow. So therefore, the complex the picture is complex. It's not as simple. And this map of lithologs from the Mehdi paper sums it up beautifully. You have here, you see, the gray fluvial sand. If you look bottom left, gray fluvial sand, which is a kind of dark green here. And this is the Himalayan origin sand. Then you have all kinds of mixed sand layers, silty, clayish levels, and so on. And but we are interested in this one. And you can see that here, for example, it comes very close to the surface, whereas at other locations it's very deep. So this confirms the resistivity studies beautifully. And these are the lithologs. And it also shows us some very important things. Number one, that depending where you dig, where you take your sediment core, you're going to have a very different story. And if you take only one, of course, geologists do not do that. They know very well that the more cores you have and the more secure your conclusions are going to be. But if you were to take only one, you would not have, any valid conclusions to offer. But so therefore, you need to really cut across not only one channel, but many channels to be able to create a story of what might have happened. So therefore, this conclusion by Orengo and Petrie, which I showed their paper earlier, synthesizing all the remote sensing and some of the geological evidence, and they warn us basically that the story is much more complex than previously thought, right? And there are hundreds of paleochannels, and basically we have floods, we have river avulsions, we have also, as I said, neotectonics. There are also some documents on this, and ultimately we have an extremely complex picture in which water availability and location is dependent upon a multiplicity of factors and difficult to predict in the long term. So this is just, a sobering piece of reflection. We have now a kind of a broad consensus that the major contributions, as I said, from the Sutlej and from the Yamuna terminated long ago. For the Yamuna, possibly 12, 14,000 years ago. For the Sutlej, possibly 8 to 10,000 years ago. And yet we have at the same time the possibility, and here I mentioned the study by Anirban Chatterjee, who's PhD student under Professor Professor Ranjan Roy of PRL, Jyoti Ranjan Roy, and we have here a story where we see that sometimes they got secure dates by dating shell, not only by OSL, but by dating shell, which was found embedded in some layers. So you can easily get good radiocarbon dates, and it's always better, of course, to combine both radiocarbon and OSL dates if you can, because there are uncertainties for both systems. So when the two systems converge, then you are on a very secure chronology. And here they found that in some locations, they found that this gray fuel sand, micaceous sand, which is the signature of higher Himalayan contributions, was pretty close to the surface, and sometimes reaching dates which were fairly recent, like you see here, 4.8 kiloyears, which means that we are 2800 BC roughly, and that would be the period when the Harappan civilization is going to come up, the cities are going to come up. So here it means that perhaps there were, and this has been one of their conclusions, occasional reactivations or late survival of a few channels, not the dominant channels, but a few channels, in this case from the Sutlej. You can see here the ground level is here on the top right of the photo, and you can see here the gray micaceous sands very, very close to the surface. So it all depends where you look. Sometimes it will be 40 meters deep and so on. So some of the conclusion was that for the most recent days they got, it was going, as I said, almost close to the beginning of the Harappan civilization, but otherwise sometimes much older dates which were matching other researchers. So I can skip these details, but the point is that we have again a complex picture. I'm coming to some other contributions, but before I do, I want to show a very recent work by Ajit Singh, who was a postdoctoral fellow at IIT Gandhinagar here. We had contributions from PRL, as you can see, and we acknowledge the contributions of the OSLTL lab and the very kind help of Professor Ashok Singhvi in getting those dates. And this was a study of one tributary of the Ghaggar system called the Markanda River, which has a beautiful valley. This is known as the Nahan Valley sometimes, just north of Haryana, in the southern part of Himachal, and a very, very broad, surprisingly broad valley. And we wanted to kind of quantify, if possible, the contribution of this river to the Ghaggar system and possibly to the Indus civilization. And surprisingly, some major flood events were found to happen as recently as less than 2,000 years ago. So this was unexpected because it was thought that, you know, this whole system kind of goes dry at that time. It's not so simple once again. So we have larger flooding, and this is another paper, more recent, larger flooding of the foothill rivers that sustained flows in the downstream reaches of the Ghaggar-Hakra Paleochannel during the late Harappan civilization. So again, difficult to tell one simple, proven, consistent story that will, you know, account for the totality of this territory. We are not yet there, but some ingredients are building up. So here, this is the map by Ajit Singh and his co-authors. And you see that he repeats the paleo channels that Yashpal had traced, and some others more recently delineated, including this Markanda here, which flows very nicely during good monsoons. And you see that it also flows into the Ghaggar system and finally into Pakistan. So now let us come to the important geological question, which is that we have basically two schools of thought. We have a lot of geological studies. There is, for example, well, we have some geologists who assume that glacial contributions contributed to the Ghaggar system and the Saraswati system during the Harappan civilization. So this is an older school of thought which argued that we have a very major Saraswati river, perennial, and with glacial sources flowing during the Harappan civilization. This is no longer, you know, the mainstream view. The mainstream view, and there are papers by this, you know, team of Josan, Clifton, and others. There are also papers by Professor Ashok Singhvi and various co-authors, which assume that rather argue and bring up evidence to show that, as I said, the major contributions of the Satluj and the Jamuna had ended long before the Harappan civilization. But there we have two different views again. One is that there could have been, you know, perennial rivers during the Holocene and during the Harappan civilization. But the monsoon weakened, the monsoonal rivers gradually dried up or became seasonal, and the courses changed. But we have also, as I said, this is by a postdoctoral fellow who worked, Aditi Dave, who worked under Professor Singhvi, that all major rivers of Himalayan origin ceased to flow through this region before the Holocene, and certainly well before the Harappan culture. Now the question is whether this means that there were no rivers flowing, no major rivers flowing at all during the Harappan civilization. We accept that the major contributions had ended, but does it mean that there could not have been one perennial river flowing purely fed from you know, monsoonal sources here, as Josan et al. Assume, from all those streams flowing from the Shivaliks? We have to keep in mind, in favor of this argument, that there is now considerable evidence to show that the climate during the major part of the Harappan civilization was much wetter than it is today. The precipitations were more, especially during the winter season. And therefore, if we have ample rainfall, which seems to have dried up from 2200 BC, there's something called a great drought, which struck many parts of the world, and definitely the Indian subcontinent from 2200 BC, and this would have been the end of the very wet phase. If we have this wet phase, if we have also a much better forested slopes of the Shivaliks, which are able to retain a lot of rainwater and release it during the drier season, then it's entirely possible to project a picture of a minor but possibly perennial river during Harappan times. So this is the question which remains to be resolved, because if we assume that no rivers were flowing at all, then we have this problem here in my last question, which is how do we explain that Harappan sites like Kalibangan, which I showed you on a map, was built right on the edge of the riverbed. This is, you see, River Ghagar, and you see that the entrances to these fortifications are facing the riverbed. We are now in, please keep the date in mind, 2600 to 1900 BC, about 700 years, plus minus 50 years, or even 100 years if you like. But you know, we have a fairly secure chronology with hundreds of radiocarbon dates from many Harappan sites. So we are in the 3rd millennium BC, and by 1900 BC, this city is abandoned. People move away. There could be various explanations. There are, in fact, various explanations proposed for this abandonment. I'll come back to it in a minute. But the city is built facing the riverbed. And this is also the case of Banawali here in Haryana. So Kalibangan is in Rajasthan, please keep in mind. Banawali is in Haryana, and you have the city facing the dry bed of the Saraswati. These are sketches by a Archaeological Survey of India. And you have also Birana facing here the dry bed of the Saraswati. Even Rakhigarhi, which is a major Harappan city, still being excavated and still not fully understood, is on one paleo bed, though not as important as these here. So why should the Harappans, if there are no rivers flowing, take the trouble of building such cities on the edge of, on the banks of such paleo beds, of such dry beds, if there are no rivers? It doesn't make sense. And here the message of archaeology, which is why we need a multidisciplinary approach. The message of archaeology is very clear that the river communication was essential to the sustenance of the cities, not only to bring, you know, archaeology, agricultural goods, food basically, to sustain those cities, but also for the trade. Harappans were great traders. They were great craftsmen. It was possibly their main dominant occupation. And, you know, when you are indulged in trade, you need a good trade network. And bullock carts are not going to work across such a vast network, where you need to communicate with Harappa in Punjab, with Mohenjo-daro in Sindh, and some of these communications have been actually traced. So, you know, steatite objects have been moving from one region to another. Dholavira stone pillars from the Rann of Kutch have been found all the way to Harappa in northern Punjab. So these movements are well understood, and therefore they do need river communication. So the message of archaeology here is that, okay, if there were no, you know, major glacial fed river in Harappan times, fine, that has to be accepted, but there has to be nevertheless some perennial, perhaps diminishing river, which, you know, was further diminished by the movement to a drier climate, but there had to be some river during the Harappan civilization. So in fact, Dr. R.S. Bisht, excavator of Dholavira, and Professor Prabhakar, who is with us at IIT Gandhinagar, even plotted some of the Harappan sites in Haryana, not all of them. They deliberately selected some which are on known paleo channel, and this is a rigorous plotting based on remote sensing data, just to show that certainly they were not here randomly. There are, of course, sites which are outside of these paleo channels. They may have been on minor channels, or they may have been on no channels at all, quite possibly. But we have to accept that if you find this kind of configuration, it is because there is still some water, maybe less and less, but some water flowing there. So therefore, the scenario which I've proposed is that the mega river, as it is called, disappeared long ago, millennia ago. Definitely it had contributions from Yamuna, from Sutlej. Yamuna ended probably 15,000 years ago, Sutlej 2,000 years ago, as I said. This has to be accepted because there's plenty of evidence now, but there could still be occasional contributions from the Himalayas, and the work by Anirban Chatterjee and Jyoti Ranjan Roy seems to be very convincing evidence of that. And we would have therefore to now be happy with a perennial rain-fed river, not glacial-fed river, during the early Harappan phase and probably extending to the mature and to the end of the 3rd millennium BC. I'll be skipping this detail, very interesting though, from Rafiq Mughal, the Pakistan archaeologist. So we definitely know from paleoclimatic study, Yama Dixit and several other researchers have contributed a lot to this field, that by 2200 BC, we move into a much drier phase. There is aridity. Therefore, whatever rain-fed sources there may have been are now slowly drying up. And this could be why one contribution to the end of the urban, mature means urban, the cities, the existence of the cities, and all of them disintegrate. Not all of them. In Gujarat, we have a slightly different picture, but in this region, they disintegrate about 1900 BC, plus minus 50 or 100 years. So intermittent revivals are always possible, but anyway, this is the end of this brilliant civilization. And by 1900 BC, Ghaggar has become a completely seasonal foothill river, which is explained by the dry climate most probably, and possibly tectonic events also. This is a picture that sums up the continuous line of settlements in the early Harappan phase. In the mature Harappan phase, there's a short break here, which Rafiq Mughal noted, which is possibly the first major sign of a breakup. And then you have here, okay, my time arrow has stopped working, but you have here, after 1900 BC, a complete desertion, abandonment of the central basin of this Ghaggar-Hakra river. So those sites here in Pakistan are still fed by some branches of the Sutlej. But here we have now rural settlements. All of them are hugging the Shivaliks or the Yamuna system, right? And it becomes very clear now that they can still get a little water from here. Anyway, they are gone back to a rural lifestyle where you no longer need, the assurance of full flowing rivers. So this is a picture which seems compatible with most of the geological data, of course the archaeological data, and perhaps the texts. So these are more maps which show you, these are different studies which show you the abandonment in the post-urban phase, though I disagree with these two red dots because they are mature Harappan sites, and actually they are not there in the post-urban phase. And this also is a more detailed by Dr. Prabhakar, which shows us again this abandonment of urban phase sites, that is the cities, after 1900 BC. So something has very clearly happened to this system. It's a major breakup now, and it matches well the paleoclimatic data of this drier phase starting to 2200 BC. Now there's another problem. I'm not sure whether I have time to touch upon it. Maybe I should very briefly mention it in summary without even looking at my slide, and that is why there has been some kind of a controversy about this Saraswati, and why some scholars decided that this is not the Saraswati of Rig Veda. And the problem is very simple. In the Rig Veda, this is a mighty river. It is fully flowing. When do we see that? We don't see that at the time when the Aryan composers of the Rig Veda are supposed to have entered India, and by the time they reach this region, which is somewhere between 1500 and 1200 BC, going by the mainstream theory, there is no Saraswati, there is no river flowing in any major way. So how come they describe a full-fledged river fully flowing from the mountain to the sea? It's not possible. It doesn't work. If you want such a picture, you have to go during the Harappan phase or even before, because there's already a break happening before the mature phase. So therefore, you would have to date these hymns back to 2700, 2800 BC or earlier. And that doesn't match the theory of Aryans entering India in the middle first millennium BCE. So that's the contradiction which came to light in the 1980s and which caused some of the scholars, especially historians basically, to say that, well, in that case, that's not the Saraswati. But the problem is that, Rig Veda is very clear that the Saraswati is between Yamuna and Satluj. So what do you do? Well, what you do is that you create a second Saraswati. You say, well, the first was somewhere in Afghanistan or elsewhere, and that's where the river was fully flowing, and that's where the Aryans were located. And when they come to India, then they create a second Saraswati between Yamuna and Satluj. The problem is that, if they wanted to honor the memory of the first Saraswati, why should they give this name to a defunct channel? It doesn't make any sense. They would have chosen a fully flowing Indus or one of its tributaries, and that would have been, honoring the Afghan Saraswati, the erstwhile Saraswati properly. So this is the reason for the controversy. I have dealt with it in my book, and I have proposed my own answer. But this is basically the end of our journey. And you know, of course, that the Saraswati has its own evolution as a goddess. In the Rig Veda, it's purely the goddess of intuition. There are hymns asking Goddess Saraswati to impel our thoughts, to guide our intuition, and so on. Then she becomes goddess of speech in the Yajurveda Vach, and ultimately goddess of all knowledge, because knowledge is communicated through speech, goddess of the arts, goddess of education, of course, but that's a later evolution. And in conclusion, whatever may have happened to this, this whole story from the Rig Veda, the point is that the disappearance of the river forces the mature Harappans to migrate. They probably migrate in all directions. Definitely towards the Shivaliks, we have seen that. Probably perhaps a little southward. There are late Harappan sites in northern Maharashtra, for example. Maybe towards the Indus, because there are still a lot of late Harappan sites around the Indus. And also across the Ganga, because that was not Harappan territory. And there are now enough signs of cultural transmission from the Harappan world to the Gangetic world, where the new urbanization of India will re-emerge in the first millennium BCE. So I take it this is my own, proposed picture or narrative as a symbol of the loss and recovery of Indian civilization and culture, which will be often present in Indian literature, for example. So this is, in short, our journey. This is a Harappan figurine saying thank you or namaste, and this is as briefly as I could put it, the story of this river and all that goes with it. But I just want to remind you, if we really want to create the narrative, it is not fully complete. We have to go multidisciplinary. Definitely, we need inputs from a lot of disciplines. So I will stop sharing my slides, and I'll be very happy to take questions if we have time for them.
Thank you, Professor Danino. And you have a wonderful talk. And we have a wonderful journey about our holy Saraswati Indus civilization. My session, last session, question answer session. I would like to invite Professor Deshpande to initiate the question answer session. Over to Dr. Deshpande.
Thank you so much, Professor Shukla. Thanks for this opportunity. And thank you, Professor Danino, for such a wonderful talk. And I'm sure there'll be many questions. And I request the panelists attending on WebEx to kindly raise their hands so that I can accordingly request. And in the meantime, there are also some questions on the chat box. So first of all, let's see from the WebEx if there are colleagues. Yeah, I can see the request from Professor Pallam Raju. So Professor Pallam Raju, kindly ask the question, please.
Thank you, Professor Deshpande, and thank you, Professor Danino, for this excellent, talk on the whole tracing back the river and also various things that have happened in the past and putting a lot of timelines to it. My question is: are there other examples of other sites and places in the texts which have been discovered later by remote sensing, or why is this unique, Saraswati? Why, or because of its this got extra attention because of various other facts, or are there other sites of this kind in the texts?
It's not absolutely unique. Of course, there was a lot of attention given to this because, the Yashpal was of course a very well-known figure, and Landsat satellite photos came in the 1970s. They were the very first which were available. There were some aerial photographs earlier, but they were not so detailed and not so sweeping. So there was a lot of excitement when the Landsat imagery became available. But there are other cases, I mean, a lot of cases of archaeological explorations using satellite imagery in India. And, there is, in fact, there is a whole issue of current science which was published on this. And there's a whole book, I think, edited by Dr. M.B. Rajani of NIAS, Bangalore. She's herself an expert on satellite imagery applications for archaeology. So she gives examples of, satellite imagery, for example, for Mahabalipuram, which has brought to light unknown aspects. Nalanda, possibly showing places which are unknown to the archaeologists, which could be extensions of the site of Nalanda. So there are quite a lot of locations in India where now satellite imagery is used by archaeologists to supplement the ground data and sometimes to guide them, just as they will also use ground penetrating radar. They will use laser scannings, etc. So there are lots of tools now, and remote sensing is routinely used in archaeology, but the Saraswati has been certainly one of the major examples of this method. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. We have Dr. Naveen Chauhan requesting to ask a question. Naveen, please ask the question.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Danino, for such a nice talk and sharing your knowledge about Saraswati. So basically, the question I have is related to like Ghaggar. Is in the Rig Veda, Ghaggar also mentioned, like earlier you mentioned that Saraswati is mentioned in Rig Veda. Ghaggar is Ghaggar also mentioned there? Or is it the shift of the Saraswati which has led to the present day Ghaggar river? Which is the possible scenario?
So very simply, the word Ghaggar does not appear at all in any ancient Indian text. Not only Rig Veda, but even later texts do not know this word Ghaggar. It seems to be of medieval origin, but there is no certainty. In my book, I've quoted scholars proposing 2-3 different etymologies. One is about the sound of the water, and there is also one Ghargara river somewhere in UP. The gurgling sound of the water is one possible explanation. There are 2-3 others, but it's not a very ancient name. It's probably as far as the medieval period, and therefore the simple conclusion was that it had to match the major bed of the Ghaggar, because Ghaggar itself has a lot of branches, but the major Ghaggar bed is probably the relic of the Saraswati of Rig Veda. This has been kind of the consensus. So it's Saraswati, the name retreated to the little tributary on the northeast, okay? The name retreated to that portion, and the name for the major Ghaggar channel was kind of forgotten, and at some point the name Ghaggar came into it. This is the picture which I was able to gather, which makes a sense of the whole thing, but it's not an ancient name. And I would like, by the way, to thank you for your very kind collaboration in a lot of analyses that have been done for some of these researchers, and even now you keep helping our students, postdoctoral PhD students from IIT Gandhinagar. So that's very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, you're welcome, sir.
Thanks. Dr. Harish Gadvi, can you please ask your question?
Hello, sir. It was very wonderful talk. Actually, what I have two questions, and one question what I wanted to ask Naveen has already asked. So a little bit you can clarify. I mean, out of all the rivers like Yamuna, Ganga, Sindhu, all they retain their original names, but only the Saraswati happens to change its name to the Ghaggar. Do you have any idea how to that?
Simply because it dried up. Simply because it dried up. But if you see, for example, Mahabharata, as I said, there is, it is the Saraswati region. There is even a pilgrimage of Balarama, the elder brother of Krishna. There's a whole chapter on his pilgrimage from Prabhas in Gujarat. So Prabhas need not be the current Prabhas Patan of Saurashtra. It may be probably more towards the run of Kutch. Whatever, upstream the Saraswati, but it records the disappearance of Saraswati under the sands of the desert, from time to time, and then it re-emerges here and there, and finally he reaches Vinashana. Vinashana is the point of disappearance, and from there it is continuous, and it goes upstream all the way to. So it's a very fine description, semi-mythological. There are all the legends attached to the disappearance, but very clearly Saraswati disappears at some point, and that explains that the name of the channel doesn't have to be retained. Once you have, a dry river flowing only during a bit of monsoon, then the name might not be retained. The name of the other rivers was retained because they were perennial. They never disappeared. So then the name remains perennial also. You see, this is simple.
But my reasoning was that if the peoples are still living there, then they will continue to use that name. Even people move from their places to other places, they use the same name. If the name has to change, that means that area has to go totally void of the peoples. I mean, all the civilizations that exist.
There were certainly migrations. As I said, the late Harappans migrated. They had to abandon the central part. But you see, the name Saraswati remains as a tributary of the Ghaggar. What happens is that the main branch of the river lost its name. And it is still, it can be explained if the river stops flowing, to my mind. But as you say, when people, migrate, sometimes they keep the name. And that's exactly what has happened. We have, as I said initially, I think we have 20 Saraswatis across the whole of India, which means people wanted to keep this memory somehow. And so in Haryana, we have only this small stretch of the river. But in Gujarat, we have two. In Rajasthan has one at Pushkar, in fact, and so on. So there are lots of Saraswatis all over the place. And exactly why this name Saraswati switched to Ghaggar at a certain point of time, unless we know the precise history of the region, is difficult to answer. And when was the name of Ghaggar first in use is not precisely known. It seems to be from medieval times. So we'll have to, understand the whole historical context of the region.
Another question is about if we take the river as a bounding box for the Vedic civilization that existed, then do we have an information onto the southern borders like Narmada, or is this rivers mentioned into the Veda?
No, Narmada is not mentioned in Rig Veda. Rig Veda geography is very much the Sapta Sindhava. which means the northwest of India, the whole Indus, or up to Ganga, because Ganga, as you saw, is named, but only once in the Rig Veda. Only one, where I showed it, is Ganga mentioned in the Rig Veda at all. Ganga is not an important river in the Rig Veda. Yamuna is mentioned a couple of times. It is mostly centered on the Saraswati and the Sindhu. Sindhu is very also a very mighty river in the Rig Veda, no doubt about it. That is the region. So Rig Veda does not seem to know anything east of Ganga or south of the whole Indus system, Indus Saraswati system, if you like. It doesn't seem to, and very interestingly, this is also the Harappan territory. The Harappan civilization was exactly there. That's exactly the location also of the Harappan civilization.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah. We have Professor Sanjeev Kumar wanting to ask some question. Professor Sanjeev Kumar, you may please ask.
Thank you, Professor Danino. It was a nice talk. I have a question, maybe very basic. That normally when we talk about Saraswati, we talk about the Sangam, right? At Allahabad. Ganga, Jamuna, Saraswati, that is what they say, the Triveni. And the Saraswati path which you showed is completely off track. So is it the Saraswati, so-called Saraswati in your Allahabad is one of the 20s which you mentioned? Or if at all we are concerned about Saraswati, why, in mythological perspective, which I think we are concerned, then why we are not looking for Saraswati which flows through Allahabad? And why we are concerned about Saraswati which you are
so
system?
I think the question is easy to answer. It is not the Saraswati which I showed, which is off track. It is the Allahabad Saraswati which is off track. In fact, there is no Saraswati at all in Allahabad or Prayagraj. What you have is Ganga and Yamuna. That's all. There is no Saraswati. It's a cultural device, as I have tried to argue in my book. People wanting to remember that ancient river which was praised so much and deified and revered so much in the Rig Veda and later literature. They wanted to remember, and this to me is one more evidence of a migration. You have people migrating, carrying this memory and wanting to fix it here and there on the landscape. So sometimes they will fix it on a natural river, sometimes because this site of Ganga and Yamuna must have been very impressive. These two rivers must have been very impressive 2,000 years ago. Today they are not so impressive, unfortunately. They are getting depleted. There are so many dams, so much of diversion to irrigation and so on. But
so basically,
they would have wanted this spot to become, a holy spot. There was a decision by someone we don't know. We'll never know who decided. Let us say that Saraswati is there, and it is invisible. The texts say Adarshana. It is Adarshana Saraswati, invisible Saraswati. The texts do not even claim that Saraswati is actually physical river there. It's an invisible river.
So the name Triveni is a misnomer, basically, right?
Well, it is a cultural creation. You take it like that. Okay. And we have, by the way, at least 4 or 5 Triveni Sangam in India. There is one in Tamil Nadu near Erode with the Bhavani River. There is one small in Saurashtra, north of Prabhas Patan today, which is composed of a tiny Saraswati river. There is a Kapila river, and the third, just now I don't remember the name. 3 small seasonal rivers, but it is called Triveni Sangam. Okay. And I was told of 1 or 2 other Triveni Sangam. So these are traditions, and the number 3 is especially important. You have the 3 worlds, you have the 3 heads of Shiva, and so on and so forth. So Trikala Drishti and so on. So it's not nice to have a junction of just 2 rivers. That's too common. It's not something remarkable. If you have 3, it becomes very interesting. So there are some are physical and some are mythical. You can say that Saraswati is a mythical river at Allahabad, Prayagraj. Yes, there it is mythical. But Saraswati, the western flowing Saraswati, which Rig Veda talks about, because it's definitely western flowing, that to me cannot be described as mythical, because there's a consistent picture in the literature and all the evidence which you have seen.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a request from Bharti Ganesh. Bharti Ganesh, would you like to ask the question? You raised the hands, but you have lowered it.
It's the same question that Professor Sanjeev asked, so I kind of lowered the hand.
Okay, great, fine. So, Professor Devabrata, you may please ask the question.
Professor Danino, thank you for discussing the evolution of the river Saraswati in a very fundamental and basic manner. My question to you is the following, that, the spatial resolution of the sensors on remote sensing satellites have changed from the days of Professor Yashpal, and now you have very high resolutions, spatial resolutions, possibly of the order of meters or better. So has anybody looked at the trajectory of the paleo channels using the latest satellite sensors, and whether there is any change in the trajectory of the paleo channels, particularly Saraswati, if you look at it? The other question I have is whether there exist any questions regarding the dating of shells, carbonates, whether the closed system assumption is valid there, and any questions on the resetting of the OSL signal, because these are fluvial sediments. So have they been well bleached, and other dates? Is there any other work which is necessary to confirm the existing dates?
Dr. Banerjee, yeah, very good questions. The first is easy to answer. Yes, of course, there's a lot of high resolution imagery now available. And this is what ISRO initiated in particular, some beginning perhaps some 15 years ago, something like that, maybe 20 years ago. But then since then, we've had a lot more. And the problem is that the high resolution satellite imagery does create a huge amount of data, which was not available earlier. But what it has done mostly is to bring up more and more and more paleo channels, which were not easily detectable by, the Landsat imagery, for example. So in fact, in a way, instead of saying that, allowing us to conclude that this is the channel, it has confused the picture, if I may say so. Not confused, it has enriched the picture, but it has shown the complexity of what happened on the ground, which is why, I showed these pictures by Mehdi et al. And the synthesis in the recent paper by Oregon and Cameron Petrie of Cambridge University, where basically this is all satellite imagery and most of it high resolution, recent, most of it. And you see that there are hundreds of paleo channels. So to now say that we can recreate the correct evolution of all these paleo channels with relation to each other, no, absolutely not. It will take thousands and thousands of sediment cores to be analyzed and dated for a comprehensive history to be possible. We are still very far from that if we wanted to, but let us say the main paleo channels have been reasonably well explored by a number of geological studies. I mentioned, Clift, I mentioned Josan, I mentioned, of course, Professor Ashok Singhvi. There is Professor Jyoti Ranjan Roy and Anirban Chatterjee, and so on and so forth. Our Ajit Singh and so on. So there are lots of dating of sediment cores, but the problem is that even a few hundred days will not be quite sufficient because the story is so complex. That's the conclusion at present.
Thank you.
Yeah. Professor Danino, I also have a couple of questions, but I think I would like to do justice to those who have written here in the chat box first. So I'll just read out. There's a question by Bhaskar Mukherjee, and the question is: fossils found, human and animal remains. So perhaps he wants to ask that have we found any fossils?
Very quick answer. There are human remains in Harappan sites. I forgot, Dr. Banerjee, to answer that yes, some dating of shells has been done by especially Anirban Chatterjee. So this gave a lot of good radiocarbon dates, which were very good corroborations of the sediment dates. But human remains not in the channels particularly, as far as I know. I've never heard of any human remains coming directly from the paleo channels, but from Harappan sites there are graves, not many, and now the consensus is that most Harappan dead were cremated. Because if they had all been buried, we would have thousands and thousands of skeletons. It's not the case. Many sites do not report any skeleton. Even Dholavira, a huge city, reports only 1 or 2 skeletons for the entire period of the city. So therefore, there are a few skeletons. There is only one case of extraction of DNA, even that is partial. It is from Rakhigarhi. Conclusions to me are still sketchy, and because one skeleton to draw conclusions from for the entire civilization is not, of course, possible. Lot of bioanthropological studies have been made right from the 1940s onward on the various types, physical types, phenotypes, as bioanthropologists say. So all these studies are well done, well understood, and we have a lot of good papers on that. If you wish, you can write to me and I'll point you to some of those papers. But this is limited to the urban sites.
So Professor Deshpande, I think our director has raised a hand, so I would like to ask a question. I can see.
Oh, okay. Professor Bhardwaj, please ask the question.
Thank you, Dr. Deshpande, and thanks, Michael Danino, for a very excellent talk, linking the histories with respect to what we understand right now with respect to this Saraswati River and Indus civilization. But going through your talk, a lot of things went into my mind in terms of understanding the timelines. So as a layman, I'm asking you this question. Can you just depict on a timeline with respect to when was Vedic Rig Veda written, vis-a-vis the Aryan invasion, the happening of Mahabharata, the Harappan civilization to the current, so that we get a history of or the chronology in the time period?
So Professor Bharadwaj, I really wish I could answer those questions. There have been huge questions dividing scholars, different schools of thought, tons of argument, counter arguments, and some of these questions, for example, dating the Vedas, dating the Mahabharata are almost 200 years old. They were debated right from William Jones, the first translator of Indian texts in the 1770s. William Jones was the first Sanskritist to offer Indian translations, English translations of Indian texts. So the issue in summary is this. Indus Harappan civilization, no problem. We have lots of objective physical dates. But when you ask what is the date of the Rig Veda, for example, well, the question is whether there are broadly 2 schools of thought. There are actually more than 2, but I have to simplify. One goes by the Aryan invasion or migration theory, which says that Aryans, or Indo-European speakers, entered India about 1500 BC. Okay, and by the time they reached Saraswati and Ganga, it would be 1200 BC or so. This is still the kind of leading school of thought, which you will find in many textbooks in India and abroad. Then, of course, the Rig Veda is dated to any time between 15 and 1200 BC. But the problem is there is a lot of counter evidence from archaeology, because there is no evidence of any intrusive culture, material culture, about that time entering India. And that creates a problem. There are no settlements which can be identified as Vedic. There are no tools, no weapons, no artifacts that can be identified as Vedic. And most Indian archaeologists have rejected this theory of an Aryan migration into India simply because they say it's invisible on the ground. And now the argument of the Saraswati comes. that, you know, if they come, how can they give this name Saraswati to this river, which is dry by that time? So therefore, the second school of thought is that perhaps there was no Aryan invasion or migration. And perhaps the Veda is much older. And going by several, you know, lines of arguments, which I will not develop because it would take too much time, perhaps the Veda actually precedes rather than follows the Harappan civilization. Now, even then, it could be that, you know, Indo-European speakers, sometimes called Aryans, but this word Aryan is very misleading, would have entered India in pre-Harappan times. So there is also one small school of thought like this. Others will even create what is known as out of India theory, that actually Indo-European speakers originated from India and migrated outward. All these schools of thought are there. The debate goes on. It's not going to be easily resolved until we get some clinching evidence. What could be clinching evidence? For example, the decipherment of the Indus script. You know, the Harappan seals. They have a script. And a lot of research has been done on that, but there is no accepted decipherment because the inscriptions are so short. So if one day there is a decipherment, and it's possible that it will happen, then we will know at least whether the language of the Harappans was Indo-European, which will prove that, you know, Indo-European speakers were there in or before Harappan times, or was it something else? Was it some Proto-Dravidian? Was it some third language? All possibilities are there. So we may have to wait to decide all these big questions. Regarding Mahabharata, there is something very simple to be said. There is the story. Now the question is whether the story was a real story, whether it's a historical story or not. There again, you have all kinds of schools of thought. From historicity to fictional story, you have all opinions. But the text itself is well understood, and there is not much debate on this, to have been written from about 200 BC, maximum 300 BC onward. Now, there are again schools of thought. Some say that the writing of the Mahabharata stretches over 300 or 400 years. It would go on till 200 AD or CE, Common Era. Others say no, it was written at one go, let's say in 20, 30 years of time, around 200 or 300 BC. So these are minor debates of some importance in literature, but otherwise minor. But the period of the writing of Mahabharata and Ramayana is well understood to be around that. These are not very, very ancient texts. I mean, they are more than 2,000 years old, so that makes them ancient, but they are not as ancient as the Veda. See, the language, the Sanskrit language of the Rig Veda is a very archaic form of Sanskrit. Whereas Mahabharata and Ramayana are written in classical Sanskrit, and this is a much later language. So that alone tells you that, you know, they were written at a much later time. And there are lots of clues, the geography, etc., in those things, lots of clues which allow us to the social composition of India, even the political composition of India described in Mahabharata. There are lots of clues which tell us that, you know, the text dates back to 200, maximum 300 BC. I don't think there can be much controversy about that. So this is as briefly as I can put it, but your questions are very big questions, and they have been debated on and on and on, and it continues.
Deshpande, just one quick question.
Yeah.
For my understanding. So as I understand that you say the Vedas are written in Sanskrit, right?
Yes.
And that means the Sanskrit was a well-developed language at that time, which is much ahead, could be, within quotes, of the Indus civilization, right? So are there any clues of that which is available somewhere or other?
That is very debatable again. Sanskrit was a totally formed, constructed, mature language by the time of the Rig Veda. Absolutely. It's a complex language, though it is an archaic Sanskrit. Actually, it got somewhat simplified in classical Sanskrit, simplified in some respects, enriched in other respects. But it's a difficult language, and it's fully evolved. So yes, there must be some, older stages. These linguists have discussed. The question is whether we can identify anything in the Harappan civilization that is relatable to Sanskrit. In terms of language, no, because we can't read the Indus script. But in terms of possible Vedic concepts, there have been suggestions. For example, Harappans worship the swastika, and the swastika is a Vedic symbol. They also worship the people tree, and people tree Ashwatha in the Rig Veda is also worshipped. There are, some suggestions of fire altars in 2-3 locations of Harappan sites, especially Banawali, Lothal, perhaps Kalibangan. And fire worship was a mode of worship, the dominant mode of worship in the Rig Veda. So there are some parallels which are suggestive. But, these have been debated, and again, there are opinions and counter opinions. So I've proposed some in my book, and you may have a look at it. But some more research is needed, and ultimately, this whole thing will be clinched only when we can read the script.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Bharadwaj.
Professor Danino, is it convenient for you if we can go through a few more questions which are there in the chat box, or
Well,
how are you?
If you are not all tired of hearing me, I have no problem. We can
No,
spend
these are, I
a
think,
few-
very precious discussions. And since we are archiving all the presentations, so it is a rich archive for PRL also. So maybe if the organizers permit, I can take a few more minutes.
Yes,
Professor
please go
Lokesh,
ahead.
sir?
Yeah,
Fine.
yeah, please go ahead.
Right. So in the chat box, there are some comments and some questions. So Professor A.R. Chaudhary has written that kindly see the latest paper published in Archaeological Prospection Journal, published by Center of Excellence of Research in Saraswati River, which has established that the Saraswati River was a perennial river flowing through Haryana as late as 1402 AD. So this is just a comment. I don't know whether you would like to.
I will simply say I
react.
think I've seen this paper. I think the conclusions are a little hasty. Certainly, the river was depleted in the way that I have described, but this does not rule out occasional revivals, reactivations of ancient channels, either due to very powerful monsoons or due to neotectonics. So this we cannot rule out, but whether there is a perennial river right from the prehistory to 1402 AD, frankly, I don't think this is tenable. I don't think this we can sustain this theory. So I will need to have a closer look at the paper, but we have firm evidence that the river was deserted, because in the 2nd millennium BC, for example, there are sites of a later culture. It's called painted grey ware or PGW culture, right in the middle of the bed of the Ghaggar. That is proof that the Ghaggar was no longer flowing. So therefore, there is a major break and interruption, but it doesn't mean that there cannot be occasional revivals. I will have a fresh look at that paper.
Thank you. And there's a comment by Professor Prahlad Agrawal, and he's just greeting you and thanking you for a wonderful talk. And we have a question from one of our colleagues, Mr. Vaibhav Dikshit. He says that, sir, thank you for such a nice talk. You emphasized a lot on multidisciplinary research to solve historical mysteries. But now the question, how does the migration theory fit with the genetic studies done on Harappan and late Harappan sites?
No, there is only one genetic study, which is a partial DNA of one skeleton in Rakhigarhi, which to me cannot be taken as conclusive, because we already know that the Harappan population was multi-ethnic. This we know from skeletal studies, bioanthropological studies. And of course, it has to be over such a vast region. From Baluchistan to Haryana, all the way to Gujarat, of course, it has to be multi-ethnic. So therefore, to take just one partial DNA of a single individual, especially when there are big clues that most Harappans were cremated and those who were buried were perhaps outsiders. There are enough stable isotope studies of tooth enamel to show that the skeletons perhaps belong to people who were migrants into the Harappan civilization. So therefore, one single DNA study cannot be taken as sufficient or representative. We cannot draw any conclusions at this point of time.
Thank you. Our young colleague Prachi Prajapati has asked, I have seen a few lectures on astronomical evidences from the Ramayana, Mahabharata, etc., trying to trace the chronology of various events. You mentioned about the Aryans entering India when Saraswati no longer existed. So are these evidences on the timeline of Aryans entering India related to other results from such surveys in any way?
This, I'm afraid the question is a little confused. First of all, astronomical configurations from Ramayana and Mahabharata are not conclusive. The internal evidence is inconsistent. There are lots of astronomical references which are thrown into these two long texts, probably by different writers at different points of time, and we don't get a consistent picture, which is why different scholars reach very, very different dates. This cannot be taken as conclusive evidence. So as far as I mentioned the Aryan migration theory as one dominant school of thought, it is not my own opinion, because I find that there's too much contradictory evidence from the archaeological picture, from the picture of the Sarasvati, and from other cultural considerations. So how do we create an entire chronology of India that will satisfy, the Rig Veda, the Harappan civilization, the Mahabharata, Ramayana? I think it cannot be done still at the present time, because first of all, we will have to decide whether Mahabharata, Ramayana refer to actual historical events, even with some poetical, magnification, embellishment. So these are big questions. I don't think we can answer them in any final way, and there will be differing opinions. I'm just concerned here with at least fixing some landmarks from archaeology, geology, and then trying to at least reach some conclusion from the Rig Veda, taking evidence from archaeology and the Saraswati River. This was my purpose for today.
Thank you. We have one more question, and this is from Udipi Srinivas, and the question is, there is no discussion on how Saraswati could not stop flowing because of sea level rise. Arabian Sea rose by 2 meters above the current level and stayed there for 2000 years, I suppose. Could you please react?
So we have data on sea level changes, yes. There are quite a few papers on this, and studies are going on. In fact, at Dholavira also, we have a multidisciplinary study. Professor Jyoti Ranjan Roy is involved in that, trying to study whether the change in sea level could have affected, the decline of the Dholavira settlement. 2 meters, well, it was a gradual rise in sea level. And the point is that this does not impact the Sarasvati story at all, because Sarasvati had broken up much upstream at what is more or less the international border today. And this breakup was noticed by Rafiq Mughal, the Pakistani archaeologist. And this breakup dates back to about 2800 to 2600 BC. So there's already a decline. And once, the upstream river is still flowing during Harappan times, but already depleted. And therefore, it cannot be concerned with what happens all the way in the run of Kutch. Perhaps there was a local story which is different and which could have been impacted by sea level change. Hopefully, we'll have some conclusions soon, and there are several such stories. Even Lothal, a site like Lothal, might have been impacted in south of Ahmedabad. So yes, it's very important to notice the sea level change. Some Harappan sites, like at Bed Dwaraka, there is a late Harappan site, which was partly submerged by the rise in sea level. So yes, there are local stories, but we'll have to look at it all very locally and regionally. The dominant Saraswati story cannot have been impacted by this particular aspect.
Thank you very much. And now here is the last question in the chat box from Aparna Basu. Is it possible that the tectonic movement diverted the Saraswati water through Jamuna to Triveni? Can chemical analysis be done on the water to infer its source?
So this is entirely possible, or rather tectonic movements would have rather interrupted the contributions from the Yamuna into the Saraswati system. Diversion from Saraswati to Yamuna is not very clear to me. In any case, if you are going to do chemical analysis or rather, isotope studies of the Yamuna waters, what you're going simply to find is Himalayan sources. You will have contributions from Himalayan sources, and they're very, very well known. You can see the entire catchment of the Yamuna all the way to the upper glaciers. That has been very well studied. There is no difficulty about this. There was once upon a time a hypothesis that the Markanda River was flowing, which is a Shivalik generated river, which today flows into the Ghaggar, was flowing eastward into the Yamuna River. But this has been dispelled, at least for the past 15,000 years, by our recent study with under Dr. Ajit Singh. And any connection would be very, very remote, not at all recent. So I don't think any analysis of Yamuna waters are going to give us any new light on this. I think the story is sufficiently well known.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Danino, for patiently answering all these questions so nicely. I also had some questions, but I will come to IIT and ask those questions.
Please, you're welcome.
Thank you very much for your time and your patience. And over to Professor Lokesh Sahu.
Thank you, Deshpande, for very nicely conducting this question, answer, and discussion session. And it is my pleasant duty to present word of thanks. So thank you, Professor Danino, for accepting our invitation and presenting an excellent and very interesting talk on the Saraswati River and the Indus civilization. We also appreciate your time for discussion and question answer session, which is kind of 1 hour. Now I take the opportunity to thank all our audiences and viewers who have joined on YouTube and WebEx. I also thank my colleagues for very nicely conducting the discussion and question answer and overall session. I express my sincere thanks to the director, Professor Anil Bhardwaj, Dean Professor T. Poonam Ravi, and Chair of PRLK Amrut Vyakhyaan Committee, Professor Nandita, for all their support to host this excellent lecture or Vyakhyaan. Once again, thank you for all being part of the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav and celebration of India's 75th years of celebration. Please do visit our website and YouTube channels and other media platforms to get more updates on upcoming PRLK Amrut Vyakhyaan. With this, I propose to close today's PRLK Amrut Vyakhyaan session. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you very much again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Goodbye.
Bye.